Russia's war on Ukraine continues to shake transatlantic security. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk says Europe is in a pre-war era, and countries on NATO's eastern flank are preparing. Defense spending is ramping up in a massive way, far exceeding NATO's 2% of GDP commitment. The Baltic nations in particular are preparing defensive lines. Military service in those countries is mandatory. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Canada is investing in its military at a much slower pace. A cash infusion announced yesterday will see Canada hit 1.76% of GDP by the end of the decade. This as the armed forces faces what the minister calls a death spiral on recruitment. Jonathan Vseviov is the Secretary General of Estonia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Vseviov, it's good to meet you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
This week, Canada has released its defense policy update. It's still going to fall short of its 2% NATO target, get it up to about 1.76% by the end of this decade. Your country's at nearly 3%. How do you feel about some allies not meeting their targets?
Well, we're actually above 3% now. We were at 2% since before Mr. Trump made that a popular target to have. But we've been above 2% because that's a pledge we made back in Wales in 2014. We're also above 3% now because we need to be above 3%. There's war in Europe again. And Mr. Putin is not just attacking Ukraine, he's attacking every core principle of international and European security. The concepts of territorial integrity and sovereignty, he hasn't changed any of his goals. So we all need to do more. And from that perspective, Canada's decisions are obviously positive ones. You're moving in the right direction, and that's the main thing.
Do you think they're moving fast enough, far enough, given the security state right now from NATO's biggest adversary?
You know, some argue that Putin has already failed in Ukraine. His plan A failed, for sure. He intended to kick in the door and have the body politic in Ukraine collapse, after which he wanted to negotiate from a position of strength a new European and transatlantic security order. That failed. But he's on his plan B now, and it's a war of attrition where he thinks the time is on his side. So we don't know whether what we've done is enough, but stakes could not be higher. We better pick up the tempo of the things that we do on our own defense, but also with regard to helping Ukraine into the European Union and into NATO. We shouldn't rest before this is over. If we fail in Ukraine, the cost of maintaining European transatlantic security will just simply skyrocket.
Is the alliance failing in Ukraine right now, though? I mean, plan A, you're right, it failed, but there's the counteroffensive, and he had entrenched so much because of the slow delivery of aid, and now it's pushing back, and we have this standoff in the U.S. Congress that's holding back the biggest shipments of aid that Ukraine is looking for. Is the NATO alliance getting it done now?
We've certainly taken our time, haven't we? I mean, we're now talking in Europe, we were talking about the 14th sanctions package, not because we've had 14 rounds of good ideas, but because it simply takes time to build a consensus. I mean, that's how democracies function. The question is whether we have time enough, and we need to be very clear about the fact that it's the Ukrainian people who are paying the highest price at this stage, and every day we lose, Ukraine loses not just money, not just infrastructure, they lose people. So we better hurry up. We haven't failed, no, far from it. We've surprised Putin, we've surprised the world with the unity we've had, but it's not nearly enough to just rest on the laurels right now and congratulate ourselves for the things that we've done. The war is not over. And until and unless we manage to push Russia to change course and pull itself back into Russia, we haven't succeeded, and we haven't defended the notions of territorial integrity and sovereignty that are so important for not only the stability and security of the transatlantic world, but also for the world writ large. So no, I don't think we've failed. I don't think we've succeeded. I think the jury is still out there, and we have to do everything we can to make sure that the Ukrainians succeed and push Russia out.
You mentioned the challenge in getting consensus in democracies, and we're seeing that the longer this conflict goes, right? The standoff in the U.S. Congress being the most visible and probably alarming example of that. But you look at this from a situation where NATO had its meeting recently and talked about the need to come up with its own fund to directly fund the defense of Ukraine because of the challenges in the United States. And I've seen some German politicians making the point that Russia, which had an economy the size of Spain when this all started, is somehow outproducing the aid levels that is flowing from all of Western democracies to Ukraine. It seems unfathomable that it could be in this situation.
You're right, and if we take a few steps back and listen to the speeches that we ourselves give about NATO and the strength of the alliance, all of this is true. We're 1 billion people, the richest people on this planet. with the mightiest military alliance that history has ever seen, and we're in a struggle for our future with a country that Senator John McCain once famously described as nothing but a gas station with nukes. If I remember it correctly, it shouldn't even be a contest. But unfortunately it is, and the only thing that Putin still has going for him, a powerful argument that he can use at home and abroad, is this notion that in a war of attrition he can outlast us, that time somehow is on his side. That is the central argument we need to attack. So it's not only about the money that we spend on our own defense, it's not only about the assistance we provide to Ukraine, it also has to do with things like Russian frozen assets that we need to find a way to utilize, accountability, the work that the International Criminal Court is doing, bringing Ukraine closer to its goal of becoming an EU and NATO member. All of these things that would communicate to the Russians and the rest of the world that no, it's precisely in the long run where democracies enjoy an advantage and the time is on our side.
Where does Estonia stand on the issue of seizing or using the frozen assets of the Russian central bank to fund the defense and rebuilding of Ukraine? There is a division on this. I know France has said worried about legal precedent and what it might mean. Where's your country on that?
There's a discussion that's ongoing. Our position is fairly simple. We got to go in and we got to take it. For the practical reason of needing the money, but first and foremost in order to send a clear message that we have indeed reached a point of no return. That this desire, this hope that one day a Chamberlain might appear and deliver peace for our days again by making a deal and sacrificing the freedom of others in order to buy themselves stability, that this hope is futile. Until and unless we convince the Russian leadership of that, I don't think we're going to be able to push them to change course. Utilizing frozen assets is an important policy that we need to pursue in order to send that message.
So do you seize them and spend the $300 billion, or just use the revenue from it?
The revenue is a no-brainer.
Right.
But from our perspective, yes, we need to go ahead with the use of the funds themselves. I mean, look, we've all said that Russia is responsible for this crime of aggression. We've all said that at the end of the day, Russia needs to be held responsible, held accountable for the damages it has caused. We know today that just the infrastructure damage alone is more than 700 billion euros, more than, I think, $800 billion then. And we have 300 billion of Russian money here. There's a perfectly logical way. We can do it legally. We can utilize the funds in order to, as a down payment, if you will, for the cost that Russia has to pay anyhow. It's also important strategically because it would indeed send a message that the hope of a Chamberlainian outcome is futile, and that's why we need to push ahead.
You want a Churchillian outcome rather than a Chamberlain?
I think, we all saw what happens when you try to buy yourself stability with the freedom of others. Ends in catastrophe, and not just for those who are being sacrificed. I think we should learn from the mistakes we made in the past. I think we have, but the jury is still out when it comes to this war, so we need to push ahead. And using Russian frozen assets is an important policy area that we need to make progress on.
Ukraine is the major front in this right now. One of the future fronts, and front of the moment really, is the Arctic. And I know you've been speaking with Canadian government officials, and in this defense policy update we referenced off the top, there is a shift to focusing on Arctic security and sovereignty in Canada's military posture. You're a northern nation as well, with a focus on that. What is the biggest concern your country has with Russia, the Arctic, and especially with things opening up because of climate change?
In NATO we've had this saying that the alliance ought to focus on a 360-degree approach to security. We've always subscribed to that idea. And today we're seeing Russia pose a 360-degree challenge. You talk about the High North, we agree. The Russians are investing heavily in military capabilities in the High North. But we in Europe, we also focus on Africa, for instance.
Right.
We're seeing Russian malign activities pop up all around the continent. We obviously discussed Ukraine. We can talk about the cyber domain. We can talk about the informational domain. What Russia is trying to do is push us out of the security framework that we've created over the past several decades. They're a 360-degree challenge. So we have to confront them everywhere, defensively, and we have to find a way to push them to change course.
Just as a final point, how do we do that at this stage? this many years into this conflict, they're gaining. They've had Crimea now for close to a decade. You know, the consequences of past actions have not been severe. So how do you drive it home now?
Depends on how you want to look at it. 30 years ago, I would not have been able to sit here because we were occupied. We were occupied, and half of Europe was under Moscow's control. And yet, the free world was able to push Russia to change course. These big wars, they aren't just contests of arms, they are contests of wills. I'm confident that democracies at the end of the day prove to be stronger, especially in the long run. So we have to do all of the things that we've been doing up until now. Sanctions, international isolation, helping Ukraine materially, but also with the resource of hope, bringing them closer to NATO and EU membership, which is something that they aspire for. Accountability through international institutions, the International Criminal Court, and finding a way to address the crime of aggression that is being committed, utilizing Russian frozen assets. All of the above to send a strategic message to Moscow that the course they're on right now, at the end of the day, will cost them more than they're willing to put up. So once we manage to convince them of this, once we manage to convince them that we will not be changing course, that we will not be collapsing in terms of our political unity, I think we'll be able to do it again and then build a more stable transatlantic security to face the challenges we all know we're going to face in the 21st century. But we have to see through this challenge before we can address the others. If not, I mean, the list of challenges remains the same, from global issues, global, terrorism, climate change, new geopolitical players stepping up their game. The question is whether we confront those challenges from a position of strength, having defended transatlantic security in Ukraine, or from a much weaker position, not as a united transatlantic democratic world, but a group of, frankly, mid-sized powers quarreling with each other over what certainly will seem like an avoidable defeat. So my suggestion would be to win this and then go forward together.
Jonathan Vseviov, it was good to meet you. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you very much.